In the first 100 days of the Trump administration, we've seen a barrage of attacks on workers. This has included going after the collective bargaining rights of over 1 million federal workers, firing workers at agencies and dismantling the very agencies that keep workers safe, and even crippling the National Labor Relations Board by trying to fire board member Gwen Wilcox. Fortunately, her job was restored. But we're not backing down. Today, I'm joined by President of the AFL-CIO, Liz Shuler. But before we do that, I have a quick question to the Director of Health Policy at the Center for American Progress, Natasha Murphy. Natasha Murphy is an expert on healthcare, works on her whole life on healthcare policy proposals, but really, especially now with everything talked about Medicaid, is one of the go-to people in the country, and we're very fortunate to have Natasha joining us. Welcome, Natasha.
Thank you so much for having me. Really excited to be joining you today.
Great, thank you. Just one question for you. If you had the ability, this is kind of like fantasy football for Congress. If you had the ability to change any one federal law, what would that one law be?
Great question. And I think, like you mentioned, my commitment to healthcare, I had to change one federal law. I would probably institute some type of universal health coverage for all Americans. The fact that, we are really that only industrialized nation to not provide coverage automatically to all of our citizens and residents, I think is a huge opportunity and honestly a policy failure. And so I would try and correct that, because we know that, health coverage provides access to necessary and life-saving treatment and services for individuals. And so I would, kind of love to kind of switch up the the legislative vehicle just to ensure that every American has health insurance.
Wow, so we wouldn't be the only industrialized nation without it?
No, not anymore.
Oh,
not
man,
if I had anything to do with it.
I'm voting for you. I like that, Natasha. Thanks so much for joining us today and for your time. Welcome to With Liberty and Justice for Some. I'm Congressman Mark Pocan, and you are going to listen to a very worker-focused podcast today. I am a proud 30-year-plus member of the International Union of Painters and Allied Trades. I've had a union printing business in Madison since I was 23, and I'm a strong supporter of workers and the labor movement. And one of the brighter moments during this difficult period of history that we're all experiencing is the public support for workers and labor unions. Union support is at 71%, a high going back decades. And among people under 30, the support is at 91%. Why? Well, with an administration full of unelected billionaires running things and an economy with a widening gap between the average worker and the wealthiest, people get it. If you don't have a seat at the table, they get that you're likely on the menu. And it's not just wages and benefits that are important. It's working conditions, safety, and so much more. Again, the good news is people get it, but that's why support is so high. But what about the fights that we are having now to protect workers, and what is the future of the labor movement? Well, there's no one better suited to talk about all of these issues than the president of the AFL-CIO, Liz Shuler. The AFL-CIO is a federation of 63 national and international unions representing over 15 million people, I believe. Is that right, Liz? 15 million?
Right.
Wow, that's awesome. Liz was elected by acclamation to serve as the AFL-CIO president in June of 2022 after the unexpected passing of her predecessor, Richard Trumka. Liz was the first woman elected to the position of Secretary-Treasurer of the AFL and the youngest woman ever on the Federation's Executive Council, and with her background being with the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, right?
That's right.
So, Liz, welcome to the podcast. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you, Congressman, and thank you for being such a critical voice for working people in the Congress and for your history of standing up for working people and giving us a voice.
Well, it's my passion. It's why I partially came to Congress, right? Was to do these things. And I know, I've been there now, 12 and a half years. And early on, we were trying to figure out how to embed labor more into Congress. And I think we've been able to do that by having a labor caucus and having now a couple full-time staff people and having some folks on the outside maybe coming in to be fellows and things. Like, at the end of the day, we're going to have some real infrastructure of people literally just thinking about issues for working people. So I'm so happy.
You're being modest, by the way. Your leadership of the Labor Caucus has been stellar. And I was going to say, seeing you lead along with your co-chairs is tremendous, especially in this moment. And what you've been able to do to really elevate unions, the importance of working people, and having that lens in the Congress has been amazing to watch.
Well, it's a reason to get up every day and be positive about doing something, right? And same thing for you. So let's talk about the AFL. What exactly is the AFL-CIO, if someone wouldn't know, and why does it matter to people, even if you're not a union member?
Yeah, well, the AFL-CIO is a federation, as you said, of 63 different unions spanning, across every industry in the country. Nearly 15 million workers in all kinds of jobs. So we represent workers who are in more traditional jobs, you might say, and in places that folks might think, yeah, that makes sense for a union, right? Places that might be unsafe or, hazardous, like coal mining or in the steel industry or auto industry, all the way to the professional sector, to teachers and nurses and doctors and healthcare workers, on into professional athletics. Not many people know that professional athletes are union members and members of the AFL-CIO, actors in Hollywood who were on strike to make sure that they had a voice in how their industry was changing with technology, and everything in between. So whether you drive a bus or, work for state and local government, federal government, in technology, we have people in the video game industry, for example, and technology. The point is that every person deserves to have a voice on the job, to make sure that you are getting paid and respected, treated well, and you have a safe work environment so that when you go to work, you'll be returning home safely. And often having a union voice on the job is what gives you the strength and standing to advocate for yourself and your coworkers in ways that are more powerful than if it's just you by yourself.
Yeah, that collective voice, right?
Yeah.
That really, really matters. We have some of those video game unionized workers right here in my district, by the way, that you mentioned. So we're really proud of that. So when I mentioned that strong support, which is really amazingly strong support, I mean, 71% of people in a era of people with red hats and blue hats, to find 71% of people supporting unions, and under 30, 91%. What do you attribute that to?
Yeah, it's hard for us to agree on anything in this country these days, as
Right.
you said. Actually, unions are more popular than ice cream, and that's hard to do, by the way.
Yes.
So I think the idea is that people see us out there fighting. They see us standing up. A lot of people go to work and often feel powerless, feel like they don't have that the economy is not working for them. They're working harder than ever, and their pay isn't keeping up, and they're seeing costs rise, as we know. As inflation's been a real problem. So I think what they're seeing is that the labor movement and unions are out there saying, hey, wait a second. No, everyone deserves to be paid well and have a good job that you can sustain your family with. Everyone deserves to have the ability to speak out if you see something unsafe happening in your workplace. And so when people who aren't in unions see unions standing up and fighting for those things, I think they're on the sidelines cheering, right? Yeah. Especially in this moment where we know that most people are working paycheck to paycheck. Most people don't have $400 in their savings account for an emergency.
Right.
And so I think increasingly people see unions advocating for the change that so many people are hungry for.
Yeah, I don't know if you have this that I shouldn't do. I should have asked ahead of time if I was going to ask for specific stats, but I know there's something out there about the different wage difference, someone who's in a union versus not on average? Do you have that at the tip of your head?
We call that, Congressman, the union difference.
There we go.
And it's a premium, right?
Yeah,
Depending on, of course, the demographics, the
Mhm.
geography, it differs state to state. And, if you're a woman, you're making 22% more on average than non-union women, for example. If you're a white worker, Black worker, Latino worker, you're making a different premium. But
Yeah.
inevitably, it's always more.
Mhm.
You're always making more, and you always have usually paid sick days. You have, health insurance. You have retirement savings. Sometimes we advocate, of course, for more freedom on the job in terms of your ability to influence scheduling and, predictability in your life. Because most people are, sometimes working multiple jobs.
Yeah.
People are trying to advance their education at night. And so having the ability to dictate, how you can spend free time and have that be predictable is huge for people. And so I think those are things that people take for granted if you have them. And often we're won because of the fact that unions have bargained that through their contracts. And inevitably that ripples across a community, an economy, and it extends that ability for most working people to have those things.
In a place like Wisconsin in particular, I think where, Scott Walker, when he became governor, he was already running for president from day one. And that's when he destroyed public employee unions here in the state. And then they went on to, go after prevailing wage and make us right to work, all things that we never had. I mean, we had a really great, environment for workers and for businesses in Wisconsin because of that. And right now we've got a new presidential administration that, we're seeing challenges, right? More than I think we've seen in some recent history. So can we just discuss some of these? Just like to get your input on this. Look, I think first there have been unprecedented attacks on federal workers, clearly, whether it be the illegal acts of Doge and Elon Musk. Thousands of federal employees have been fired and sometimes rehired and sometimes fired again, in some cases rehired again. It's chaotic with what's going on. And I think that number is more than 200,000 federal employees that have been fired or taken a buyout. And some agencies like the IRS or the Health and Human Services have seen a quarter of their staff fired. So what's going on with this and Doge, and does Doge have the authority to do this? Can you just talk about what we're all seeing in the news every day?
Yeah, it's been stunning. We've seen even before the attacks on unions and collective bargaining, which have been fierce, as you said, nearly 1 million workers in the federal government had their collective bargaining, their union contracts eliminated with the stroke of a pen a few weeks ago. That means, of course, that they won't have the ability to negotiate a contract. They're still, of course, fighting in their union and have the benefit of collective voice and collective action, but not having their contract, that is blatantly illegal.
Right.
So we're suing in court right now. But even before that blatant attack, it has been just a dismantling of all of the federal government norms and services that we've come to expect as, folks who pay taxes in this country. We've been supporting these institutions to make sure that we have clean water, to make sure that we have safe food to eat, that our veterans get the health care they deserve when they come back after, fighting abroad. So, and not to mention the federal workforce that supports all of those things. So it is a ripple effect that I think we are going to continue to see unfold as these firings and the displacement really takes hold. We've seen, the attacks on folks like Kilmar Abrego Garcia, right? A man who was here working as a sheet metal apprentice and now has been swept up in a mass deportation that is completely ignoring due process and,
Right.
the ability to have a voice and a say in our legal system. We're seeing institutions like the National Labor Relations Board
Mhm.
that is the traffic cop for workers who stand up and say, I want a union in my workplace, and inevitably get fired because the company will do everything it can to prevent a union from coming in. The NLRB is the traffic cop. And the chair of the NLRB was fired as an independent agency without any cause, or just basically the administration ignored the fact that this is an agency that just can't be, the chairperson can't just arbitrarily be removed.
Right.
So we're suing there as well. But all of these things add up, right? The gutting of the Department of Education, Veterans Affairs. I just think about what most people in the country see, and what they see is, hey, I didn't vote for this. I didn't vote for an unelected billionaire to come in and slash all of these services. I'm living paycheck to paycheck. I'm watching the CEOs in this country making 268 times the average worker. Where's the fairness, and where is the the promises that were made to bring down costs and inflation? So I think most people hear these things on the news. It hasn't quite reached them specifically in their community yet, but I will say what happens now at the federal level, what we're seeing is going to ripple out across all the services that we rely on in this country and take for granted. We're going to start to see the impacts of.
Well, and there's a race almost going on, right? Are they going to feel the impacts before the tax cuts are passed? And,
Exactly.
recently in that bill that we just passed, that came from the Senate and the House, so they can start this process of trying to set up the cuts to fund the tax cut. Originally everyone was saying it's a $4.5 trillion cut, but the Joint Committee on Taxation came back and said, no, it's actually $5.5 trillion in order to extend these cuts. And the Senate in that same bill added room for another $1.5 trillion in other tax cuts if they choose to. So they've actually set up for $7 trillion in tax cuts. And what we're seeing right now, in many ways, have been the services starting to be affected by all of these firings. What recourse do the employees have right now? Is it largely the lawsuits, which, by the way, are being done by labor unions, and that's who's really fighting at the forefront on behalf of workers? But is there any recourse that we can to mention?
Yeah, and as you were going through that, I think most people listening, $1 trillion, $2 trillion,
Right.
$3 trillion, $7 trillion. I mean, these are gigantic numbers that people can't even get their heads around.
Yeah.
But all we know is they're tax cuts for people who don't need them.
Right.
The wealthiest among us are the ones who will be benefiting from this. Corporations who already don't pay their fair share. And then, the burden ends up landing on the average working person who is just trying to, bring home the bread and put it on the table for their families. And that mainly will translate into the services that we rely on. And I will say, as you know, Congressman, most of the so-called savings that will inevitably be what they pay for these tax cuts with will be in the form of cuts to Social Security, to Medicare, to Medicaid,
Yep.
to the big ticket items in the federal budget that we know are the services that most people have a connection to. If you're not on Medicare, you know someone who is.
Right.
Right? If you're a middle class family who has an elderly parent that is, in assisted living that is subsidized by a federal program. If you have, Social Security offices that will be closed because they're trying to, quote, find efficiency. Well, that means that someone in your neighborhood or someone is not going to be able to access their benefits.
Yeah.
So I think this is going to be very, very real. And what we can do in answer to your question about, how we can advocate or fight back is to really engage at the community level and really put the heat on your elected officials, right? To make sure that these upcoming votes have a human face on them. We are starting to see a lot of activity at the grassroots level. You saw it, a few weeks ago with some of the hands-off marches. We are in the field this week as a labor movement doing hearings, just like you do in Congress.
Great.
Said we're going to do hearings, not Elon Musk style with the Department of Government Efficiency. We have our own department, the Department of People Who Work for a Living.
Yes.
And we are actually convening in cities 400 events across the country, inviting community members, small businesses, farmers, veterans, people who work for a living, to talk about what are these impacts. Who are we talking about here that's actually going to be, the folk who will be feeling the pinch of what is happening in Washington, D.C.? So we are going to collect those stories and we're going to bring them back to the members of Congress to say, here's what we're talking about. So whether that's an action at a hearing, whether it's, doing it the old fashioned, action online and writing to your member of Congress, speaking out to your local media organizations, really bringing home what the impacts are and the fact that you're watching, the fact that you care, that you're not sitting back passively saying, oh, good luck, or thank goodness it's not me, because inevitably it will be you next.
And people want to be heard. I'll tell you, we just did a town hall last week in my district in Monroe, Wisconsin. The entire county, not Iowa County, Greene County, I think is, I shouldn't start guessing on the population, but in Monroe, the largest city, usually when I do a town hall down there, I get 75 people show up, or so. We had 260 show up, right? People want to be heard. And, I think one of the issues on the labor front that you started to talk about a little bit that I think people don't always understand the inner workings of Washington, but the National Labor Relations Board, as you said, is like the traffic cop, right? They're the ones that are making sure that employers have to treat workers fairly as they're trying to have that vote for a union, trying to create maybe that first union, trying to look at, some of the improper conduct that happens by some less than scrupulous businesses. And as you said, they just kind of without cause fired one of the board members, Gwen Wilcox, and she had to be reinstated. Can you talk just a little more about LRB? Because I know it sounds wonky, but man, it has such an impact on so many people that come in and meet with me in my office that it's worth talking about a little more.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think most people don't realize how broken our labor laws are in the country, because over time, corporations have chipped away at our rights as workers. And so it has become increasingly more difficult to organize a union because companies have put up roadblocks in the law. And so mostly when people want to make their voice heard, come together collectively with their coworkers, and they file a petition to form a union, the company will try to counteract that, mostly illegally. And they'll fire someone or they'll intimidate or harass. And we saw this, for example, with Amazon, where workers, in different warehouses in the country, there's a number of examples where an election was filed for and workers came together, which is their right under law, and the company would surveil them. They would follow them into the restrooms to make sure there weren't more than one person talking at a time. They changed the timing of the stoplight outside the facility because they didn't want people talking to at a red light, talking to a union organizer with a flyer. Putting a camera in by the mailbox to make sure that if they mailed a union ballot in, it made it seem like they were keeping tabs on who was voting, right? So these are all the things companies do all the time. And when it's illegally done, the recourse we have is for workers in the union to go to the NLRB and say, hey, wait a second, this is behavior that is obviously impinging on our rights as working people, and it's creating a chilling effect in the workplace. So having the NLRB stymied is the goal. Corporations don't want a functioning NLRB. And so being able to just Trump, summarily firing Gwen Wilcox was that message, that signal that they
Right.
would send, right? To say,
Mhm.
we're going to make sure this doesn't function. Now, I will say there is more organizing happening on the ground than at any point in my lifetime. I mean,
Right.
we have seen so much interest in people forming unions. There's organizing happening in hospitals and college campuses and restaurants, and even in places like the South where it's notoriously anti-union. We've had, places like Barnes and Noble bookstores, workers who are
Mhm.
just like, I need a voice. So everywhere you look, there's organizing happening. So that's why it's so important that we respect the rights of people to come together, and make sure that we're supporting, in this era of so much, as you said, 70% of the public supportive of unions, 9 in 10 young people under 30 supporting unions, that we should enable them to form them.
I don't even know if you could get 9 out of 10 people say like puppy, right? Like, I mean, that's a good number we got. I mean,
Really
there's
is.
no question. When you talk about Amazon, I'll never forget, Amazon being one of the biggest, companies trying to do union busting when there's real efforts out there. For a while, they had employees who had to urinate in bottles because they weren't allowed to take breaks, both
That's right.
delivery and in the warehouse. And we tweeted something out about it, and they came back at me and they said, "You don't really believe that, do you, Congressman?" And then people started submitting their photos of the bottles they have to urinate in.
That's
And
right.
a week later, they had to send an apology tweet out that, okay, you busted us. They didn't say it that way. But, those are not working conditions that anyone should have to tolerate. And if it wasn't for unions and the NLRB, as we're trying to form unions, companies have kind of, like an extra couple of cards. If you're playing poker, they're sitting there with 7 cards to begin with. For workers, we just got to make sure that we got 5 good ones. Maybe we can get a fair chance to make them have to throw 2 in. But until then, it is a lot harder. Are there any other legal cases that you want to highlight that are out there just so people can be aware of?
Well, one thing that I would say is, there's a lot of attention on federal workers right
Yeah.
now. And I mentioned we are suing. There's a number of different lawsuits, obviously, with federal workers being fired across all the agencies. We did file the lawsuit when they originally were firing probationary workers, and we won that lawsuit and were able to get, thousands of probationary workers reinstated.
Mhm.
And the one thing I wanted to mention is, if you're a federal worker, you are inundated with emails that say, what did you do last week? Give me the 5
Right.
things, or here's a fork in the road and you should take this buyout, even though there's no guarantees. If you have questions, if you're fired yourself and you don't know where to turn, we just launched Rise Up Federal Workers Legal Defense Network,
Oh, awesome.
because everyone needs to have that outlet of some legal guidance and expertise. So even if you're not in a union, of course, if you're in a union, we would encourage you to talk with your union. But a lot of people are just like, I just want to pick up the phone and be able to call someone and ask some questions, right?
Mhm.
So this network is, it's an incredible resource. It's on our website, aflcio.org. And we will connect you with a lawyer. We have lawyers, 1,000 lawyers have already signed up across 45 states
Wow.
to provide this free legal advice, an initial consultation to see if you need an additional hour. We'll offer for those who need the expertise. But you can imagine how much anxiety, how much fear, how many questions there are in people's minds when you've done everything you can to serve your country honorably. As you know, federal workers often make sacrifices because they believe in delivering services for the public. They work at less of a rate than they would in the private sector because of the security. It used to be, I'll just trade security for less pay, but that is no longer the case, as we've seen in these last few weeks. But that anxiety runs really high, and if you're summarily fired, having had good reviews and doing an incredible job, and you're angry, you're frustrated, you have questions, you can use that resource by going on our website, aflcio.org.
That's great news, because when they started the firings at USAID, my little brother from Big Brothers Big Sisters, he's in his
Oh,
40s now, but he was one of those people trying to decide what to do, and they didn't exactly know. And his union, helped him through it, but it was a tough time. So rise up on the AFL-CIO.org website. Thank you for that. Um,
absolutely.
we were fortunate, right? In the last administration, we had Marty Walsh and Julie Sue as two great labor secretaries that really, I think, were very focused on workers. But now we have a new secretary, a former Republican representative. How are you feeling about the new leadership at the Department of Labor?
Well, of course, the Congresswoman is the daughter of a Teamster, a union member, grew up in a union household, was very much in her years in Congress known as someone who believed in collective bargaining, who was a co-sponsor of the PRO Act, the Protecting the Right to Organize Act, and the Public Service Freedom to Negotiate Act. She believed in registered apprenticeship and the importance of having guidelines and standards to make sure that we have high quality programs. So all of these things led the labor movement to weigh in on her behalf during her confirmation. We were disappointed to see her, change course in terms of her responses during the hearing for confirmation in the Senate, and has since then, shown what I have feared, which has been that she doesn't necessarily get to call the shots.
Right.
That a lot of the directives that come directly from the White House are implemented without really her being able to exercise judgment. And so, we're keeping an open channel, an open door, and, talking with her team. But from what we've seen so far, the cancellation of the iLab funding, the International Labor Affairs Bureau, which does global work like making sure child labor doesn't run rampant in other countries, so that we can't compete in the US against these countries who are, artificially subsidizing wages by using children in their workforce. So that, of course, that funding cut was disappointing. Things like registered apprenticeship, the grants that a lot of unions have been a party to with the Department of Labor being canceled. So we've seen some early signs that this is not what we'd hoped for, but we still will always hold out hope that we can continue to find common ground.
Well, I agree. I can't wait till the secretary comes before my subcommittee on appropriations, and I'm sure we'll have some questions that we'll love to consult with you maybe in advance on as we're talking to the secretary. Let's just talk tariffs, because I think this is one that there's been a lot said about tariffs, but usually in 280 character increments, which is not maybe the way you talk about tariffs. Targeted tariffs can be very useful, right? If China's going to dump cheap steel in the United States, we absolutely should use tariffs to support the U.S. industry and workers when it comes to that. That's a smart tariff. But the indiscriminate use of tariffs for everything on all sorts of countries, some with only penguins, and a formula that's pretty incomprehensible, turns out to be more of a tax on consumers in the U.S. because at the end of the day, countries don't pay tariffs, people do. But can you talk about tariffs from an economic perspective that benefits workers? Because I think you and I and, Debbie Dingle, Don Norcross, Chris DeLuzio, a number of us, Pramila Jaipal, others, I think have a interesting way of really describing it, because a tariff is not in and of itself a bad thing, but how you use them really matters.
Yes, absolutely. And thank you for that, because I do think it's a complex subject, and people have very quickly had to revisit what are tariffs and what do they mean and how are they used. And you're absolutely right. We go back decades in terms of our economic and trade policy, and what we've seen how it could be done poorly, right? When the, deindustrialization, particularly of the Midwest, as you know very well,
Right.
caused a lot of jobs to go overseas during the NAFTA years, when things were implemented, assuming a level playing field in a global marketplace, which we soon found out decades later, it actually came to fruition like we thought it was going to in the labor movement, where you have countries like China who don't respect the law, who
Right.
cheat, they manipulate their currency, they dump cheap steel into the US and flood the market. And, obviously American companies can't compete in a situation like that. So tariffs were supposed to be used as a tool to level the playing field, and not as a blunt instrument across the board where you're actually attacking countries who are partners and friends like Canada.
Right.
And so we've always said that it's a tool in the toolbox, that
Mhm.
it should be used strategically against countries who are cheaters to level the playing field. We've obviously had hope that countries like Mexico, we could make targeted investments and actually have a reformed system of trade with Mexico, where we could elevate labor standards in country, so that it wasn't a race to the bottom. And we were starting to make progress, and then now we're seeing the investments for things like the rapid response mechanism as part of the US MCA be defunded. So how are we going to ever get back on top of this evening of our trade system if we're not able to follow through on the investments we need to make it fair? The other thing that gets missed here is that tariffs are a tool, as I said, in a toolbox that you have to embed with other policies to make for an economic system and a trading system that really is reliant on investments. So we started to see some of that in the Biden administration, right? Where we had an industrial policy. We actually made targeted and strategic investment that, paired with tariffs, could have actually really started to see things hum. But this administration is rolling back those investments in clean energy, for example. We were just starting to get some traction on, creating good union jobs and leveling the playing field with some of these other countries who, again, have made a lot of bets and put a lot of their own investments as a country in places like China that are eating our lunch in terms of EV, electric vehicle manufacturing.
Right.
So it really is an ecosystem. Tariffs are a tool as part of that ecosystem, and it needs to be used strategically.
Yeah. No, and I think one of the things I really appreciate too, that I don't think people appreciate enough about labor, is you're fighting for those industries, for those employers as well, because it's protecting the jobs and helping the economy in the United States. And that's what smart company realizes when they have a workforce that wants to unionize. It's a partnership, right? It's not just about making sure, we want to make sure workers are treated fairly, but when workers are treated fairly, a business does better because they're going to stay longer and you don't have to retrain folks. And, in the fact that labor does advocate for that is such an asset to business.
If businesses don't succeed, we do not have jobs.
Yeah.
And I think you're right about that. Thank you for raising it, because there is this perception that all unions want to do is disrupt and stop traffic and, try to be some kind of cog in a wheel that, impedes progress. That is absolutely not the case, because the idea is that if your company is succeeding, that's going to create more jobs and more ability to share the pie. And so that's where unions come in, is just making sure that, the 1% doesn't just continue to grow their wealth, that we should all be benefiting from, the success of an industry, or make sure that if, for example, in this era of artificial intelligence and technology, if we are going to create more productivity in our workforce using machines and technology, shouldn't everyone benefit from that growth and productivity, that we don't just reward the tech company executives that, are deploying these tools, that everyone really should be benefiting from the advances in technology.
Yeah. No, I just think it's a point that often doesn't get talked about. And you brought it up so well. I wanted to make sure I highlighted it a little bit for folks to listen to. So let's talk about the future of labor. You had a huge development under your leadership with the SEIU rejoining the AFL. Talk about that for a second.
Absolutely. And for those who don't know who SEIU is, it's the
Thank you.
Service Employees International Union, which is a 2 million member union in the service and care industry. And it's really a very diverse union. They represent healthcare workers, workers in the high rises in New York City that you may remember years ago, Justice for Janitors, where they were elevating standards for workers who are inside those buildings, making sure that they're clean and safe for folks who are working in them, among many others. But this was significant because 20 years ago, almost to the day, the SEIU left the AFL-CIO umbrella. And it was a very tumultuous period of time in our labor movement that people wrote books about. And there was a real divide in philosophy and theory of how we should be growing the labor movement and organizing to build power. And fast forward today, 20 years later, we were so excited to have the SEIU affiliate with the AFL-CIO, seeing that we are stronger together in this moment, especially where we are seeing these unprecedented attacks on workers, the erosion of the stability in our economy and how it is broken. We need a new model that works for working people, and that we can actually organize and grow our labor movement in new and innovative ways if we're all together under one roof, right? So it was a really exciting time in January when we came together we were in Texas at a Martin Luther King Jr. conference, and it was very symbolic because if you think about the history of the civil rights movement, Dr. King, the notion of civil and human rights are workers' rights, and the coming together, all manifesting at one time was really overwhelming. And it was such a joyful moment in and amongst so much negative, where people are talking about how divided working people were after the election. And I think to myself, we're actually more united than ever. Right. We, on the things that matter to working people, we are advancing a new paradigm for the working people of this country, and the labor movement coming together like that, stronger than ever, to me was exactly what we needed in that moment.
Well, congratulations on it. I mean, it's something many of us had hoped would happen over the 20 years, and it happened under your leadership, and congratulations on that. Let's end just on what you talked about a little bit earlier of the resurgence of unions in areas that you haven't seen it previously. In my district, I have a game company, a video game company that's a unionized with the work on behalf of labor. We have all the Starbucks that are organizing. We have the work that's been going on with Amazon. Just talk a little bit about the new wave of organizing and maybe organizers, and really the future that we're all so excited about.
Absolutely. And I'm glad you raised Starbucks, because the Starbucks Workers United falls under that SEIU umbrella. Workers United, of course, is a sort of subdivision or a union within the union. And I have gotten so much energy from those Starbucks workers. I will tell you, I'm sure you've seen it too and been out in the field with them. And just knowing that a union really is how you define it as a worker, right? I think people have these stereotypes of, oh, well, if I don't work in heavy industry, then, I don't really need a union. That couldn't be further from the case. Right. Unions are more relevant than ever before. And this next generation of organizers has truly made it very, very clear that you get to define what your union looks like. And, issues that surface for a Starbucks worker are going to be very different from issues that are maybe in the field for a video game developer. And so those workers themselves get to define,
Yeah.
what's important to them. And I will tell you, the video game workers that I talk to, the work that they do, it gets pushed, like shoved under the rug. I think people don't look behind the
Mhm.
curtain at what it takes to develop those
Yeah.
games. And I likened it almost to a modern day sweatshop because, they're working to deliver a game, particularly at the end of a cycle, working, 24 hours a day for weeks on end, sleeping under their desks. It's
Yeah.
barely
Right.
eating or sleeping. And really they're worried because if they don't work into those conditions, there's people lined up right behind them that will, inevitably do anything to work in
Right.
that industry, and not knowing that there should be standards for working environments. No matter what kind of work you
Mhm.
do, you deserve to have a break. You deserve, to be able to go home to your family and have, some rest, right?
Mhm.
And so I think that's what we fought for over the history of the labor movement, is to make sure that, that 8-hour day, that weekend.
Right.
So I guess our challenge now as we go forward is, what is that new weekend? Because
Mhm.
work is changing. It's looking different for different industries. And those workers really are the ones that know what's best for them, and to be able to define what modern day unionism looks like.
Mhm. Well, I'm glad Liz Shuler is the president of the AFL-CIO during this time period. I think you have a perfect skill set for this. How can people follow you, Liz, and how can people follow labor issues in general if they want to?
Well, we are at, of course, all the social channels we're on, whether you're on Blue Sky or Instagram, AFL-CIO, of course. I personally, my handle at Liz Shuler, and that's LIZSHULER. And then we have our department of people who work for a living. I would
Yeah.
encourage people to look at our site and sign up to be an activist, because that will plug you into all the actions, engage you in the community level response. And we have these hearings this week. If you want to show up, of course, they're happening at 400 places across the country. So check out our website, aflcio.org.
Well, thank you so much, Liz. I'm glad that labor is thriving and that, even more importantly, the American people want it to thrive, right? We're doing, I think, so well right now. And again, under your leadership, I just want to say thank you personally as someone who's a 30-year plus union member. It's an honor to serve with people like you and my international president, Jimmy Williams, who, I have great respect for, and so many others, great folks out there. So thank you so much, Liz. Thanks for joining us today on the podcast.
Thank you for your leadership. And as I said, for being our voice. And we can't thank you enough for fighting alongside us every single day, Congressman. Appreciate you.
Well, appreciate it, Liz. Thank you.
Thank you.